The Supreme Court rules on Obamacare and a big foster care case. Biden meets Putin and the ongoing backlash against critical race theory. We'll discuss all this and more on this edition of The Editors. I'm Rich Lowry, and I'm joined as always by the Right Honorable Charles C.W. Cook and the notorious MBD, Michael Brendan Doherty. You're listening to a National Review podcast. Our sponsor is criticalrace.org from the Legal Insurrection Foundation. More about that in due course. If you listen to this podcast on nationalreview.com, including directly on the corner, we're delighted to have you, but it'd be easier for you and better for us if you made us part of your feed at any of the streaming services out there, from Spotify to iTunes. And if you like what you hear here, please consider giving us a glowing 5-star review on iTunes. If you don't like what you hear here, please forget I said anything. So MBD, we're recording here on Thursday morning, a little earlier than we usually do. Usually we do the second ep on a Friday, but we're recording on a Thursday, and we got a couple big Supreme Court rulings that came down this morning. Let's go to Obamacare first. Not a shocker here, 7-2. The court rules that the state AGs, red state AGs that had tried to bring this suit didn't have standing to do so. People were saying this all along, kind of the best and most acute conservative legal analyst. Yet this was really the main argument. Once they gave up on the handmaid tale stuff against Amy Coney Barrett, this is the main thing they had, was that she supposedly single-handedly almost was going to strike down Obamacare if she was confirmed on the court. And she was being guarded, but with a nod and a wink, you could tell that she probably thought these plaintiffs didn't have standing. And of course, that's how she voted today. What do you make of it?
Yeah, well, listen, I can understand why some liberals are a little bit bewildered, right? Because, Republican attorneys general were bringing these challenges and they were treating it seriously. But conservative legal eagles had always been pouring cold water on the effort. And I think, in general, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems like they were right to do so. This was the in a sense, like the last challenge to the Affordable Care Act for a reason, because it was the weakest, right? The stronger ones were brought, years ago, almost a decade ago now. And the Affordable Care Act mostly survived those challenges. So it was very likely to survive this one just by default. And, you still had, you still had two dissenters on the right, but the balance of the court doesn't want to touch this for a lot of reasons, and is still basically committed to the view that the ACA belongs to the legislature.
So, Charlie, this case was really ill-conceived, to say the least, from the beginning, and it had a significant role. They tried to make it a big deal in the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation hearings, but it was also a big deal in the presidential campaign, and really highlighted the fact that Trump, despite what he said over the years, how much he favors everyone getting health insurance, had no alternative to Obamacare. At the same time, his administration was supporting this effort to overturn Obamacare. And this was the worst of both worlds, because the case gave Democrats something to hang their rhetorical argument on, but it was also clear it wasn't going to really go anywhere. And indeed, it ended up in a box canyon today.
I remain staunchly against Obamacare. It would not bother me in the slightest if a politician ran for repealing Obamacare without proposing a replacement. I think the decision in NFIB v. Sebelius was a disgrace. I think it was wrong. For that matter, I think the decision in Burwell was wrong, the second Obamacare case. But this was a bad case. Everyone said so from the start, including on the right. And not only was it a bad case, but it had a fatal flaw in it, as the court ruled today, in that the plaintiffs did not have standing to bring it. Standing, of course, is usually a conservative obsession. We, on the right, wish to limit standing so that the courts do not get dragged into every single dispute. The Democrats went all in on this for a couple of reasons. The first one was that it was politically useful because they are more trusted on healthcare. They had clearly been told by a consultant that's the best way of using the Amy Coney Barrett hearings because the rest will turn voters off. They also went in on this because this is how they see the judiciary. I think a good number of senators and journalists on the left want their jurists to behave as they predicted Amy Coney Barrett would. That's what they think they do. They either believe themselves to be legal realists, which essentially means we don't have any laws, or they think that the Supreme Court should act as an extension of their party or their agenda. And it was always obvious that that is not who Amy Coney Barrett is. That is not where the conservative judicial movement is. And I hope at least some of those who spread these rumors will apologize. I won't wait up for it. So we are, as Michael says, now at the end of the litigation around Obamacare, at least at the end of the litigation that could topple Obamacare. There will be, I presume, statutory disputes and perhaps some religious liberty disputes around the edges. And I saw some on the right, when this decision came out, baffled by why conservatives were pleased. And I saw some on the left, Benji Salin, for example, baffled as to why conservatives were pleased, suggesting that it was an opportunity to own the libs. It's not. I'll tell you why conservatives are pleased, because if you believe in the rule of law, if you believe in comprehensible rules, if you think that the Supreme Court is there to uphold the law as it is written, this was the correct outcome.
So, Charlie, let's stick with you and go to Fulton, a 9-0 decision involving the city of Philadelphia cutting off Catholic social services because they wouldn't work with gay couples as foster parents. A big 9-0 rebuke, but relatively narrow grounds. And then you have this strange dynamic with Roberts writing the opinion, which is 15 pages, and then Alito coming in with a 77-page concurrence or something like that.
Well, I think that those of us who believe in conscience rights and religious liberty and a broad reading of the First Amendment's protection should be pleased by this. It is true that it is a narrow decision. That's why it was 9-0. But first off, this was a win. The plaintiffs, who had suffered a real harm, obtained relief from the courts. So we should be pleased about that. But we should also be pleased by the structure of the decision. The majority opinion is narrow. The concurrences are not. There is a concurrence in there by Alito that was joined by Thomas and Gorsuch, in which Alito makes the case for overturning Employment Division v. Smith completely. It would have had a much broader effect. That concurrence by Alito reads like a future majority opinion if the court continues tracking in this direction. There's a concurrence in there from Gorsuch, which was joined by Thomas and Alito, saying much the same thing. And then there is a concurrence in there by Amy Coney Barrett, which was joined by Kavanaugh and partially by Breyer, in which she essentially says that she would overturn Smith if pushed, but that it wasn't necessary to reach that question in this case, and also that she's not quite sure what balancing act should replace it. That's a little less clear, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility that there are 5 votes on the court to issue a broader ruling in this area, or perhaps to overturn Smith. Now, I think that is a sign of hope, because you tend in Supreme Court cases not to see sweeping decisions. You tend to see the law change bit by bit. And as has been the case for a while now, each time the court issues a narrow ruling, those that it's ruling against tend to come back twice as hard. We saw this in the case of Jack Phillips, the Colorado baker, whose case seems possibly to be heading back to the Supreme Court as well. And I think if the holding here is deemed insufficient by the court down the line, then it will be replaced with one written by Neil Gorsuch, Clarence Thomas, Amy Coney Barrett, or Alito. Alito seems to have set himself up. And I lastly think we should be pleased because although we got to 9-0 with a narrow decision, it is good culturally when the Supreme Court speaks with one voice. And the holding was that the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment rendered the behavior of the city of Philadelphia illegal and unconstitutional. This is not a fringe position. This wasn't a 5-4 decision. This can't be cast as some illegitimate product of illegitimate elections or the unfairness of the Senate. This was 9-0. This decision had John Roberts on the same side as Clarence Thomas, on the same side as Sonia Sotomayor. And that's a good cultural message to send because far too often in the press, any claim of religious liberty whatsoever is cast as some sort of undermining of the Constitution or vestige of a white Christian America that is slipping away. And the decision today should remind people that that is not true, that the Constitution's protections apply to everybody now as they ever did.
So, Charlie, does that mean that at a certain level you are favorably inclined towards John Roberts' tendency to try to get bigger votes for things rather than being more adventurous and getting 5-4 decisions?
I think it depends entirely on the context. I think that the question of what courts can meaningfully do in upholding the Establishment Clause when you're dealing with laws of general applicability is a thorny one. I mean, don't forget, Smith was written by Justice Scalia. This was not some Warren Court era decision. This was a majority opinion penned by Justice Scalia. And maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's not. Maybe it needs massaging. Maybe it needs tweaking. Maybe it needs expanding a little bit. So in this sort of circumstance, yeah, I think this might be the best way of moving forward. There are some cases that are so obviously and self-evidently wrong, that are so completely unmoored from the text, that I really have no time for incrementalism, even if I accept it as a political tactic. Roe versus Wade is one of those. I would be happy to see Roe swept away tomorrow because there was never an argument that it was legitimate. So
MBD, the Fulton, obviously a really a welcome decision, but this Colorado court, after Jack Phillips yet again is pretty incredible. Given that we know where this is going to go, it's going to go back up in the federal courts and he's going to win again. Yeah. But Colorado courts don't care or can't read Supreme Court decisions.
Well, listen, it's true. I think that this ruling does foreshadow a better result for Jack Phillips, right? So if people may recall, Jack Phillips was vindicated. The Masterpiece Cake Shop decision is actually really historically interesting because it's like the example of Christopher Caldwell's thesis that the 1789 Constitution is in conflict with the civil rights movement, because that's basically what Kennedy says, is that, well, this is obviously a serious case between the First Amendment and the dignity of gay people, which is a consequence of the 1964 Civil Rights Revolution. And then he just avoids the conflict by saying, well, we're going to vindicate the baker based on civil rights because he was entitled to a neutral arbiter, but they were calling him a Nazi. So it kind of punted. I'm actually, the more I read of Fulton, the way less enthusiastic I am about the decision. It's welcome, and I agree with Charlie that, a 9-0 result sends a message, it builds on something. But like the case is, I mean, it's like saying it's reassuring that by 9-0 decision, compulsory Episcopalianism hasn't been enforced on the entire American Republic. I mean, Philadelphia is forced by this decision to make available its exemption to Catholic social services in order that Catholic social services can receive money and can perform adoption services. Catholic social services has never been approached by a gay couple. If they were approached by a gay couple, what they would do is refer them to another adoption agency working with the city that would accommodate them. So this is like, I mean, we're talking about literally a city that sought to just withhold something that is present in its law in order to punish not even the exercise of a religious belief, but just the fact of belief and what it could mean consequently in practice, which to me doesn't even seem like an injustice at all, saying, we can't do this work, but someone else can. And I think Alito is right in his concurrence that the ruling doesn't quite settle anything because Philadelphia can just get rid of its exemption. And then the ground moves to Smith, where it's, we were talking about laws of general applicability. And so I'm a little less thrilled about it. I mean, I hope Charlie is right that this points to a broader reconsideration. I mean, on the other hand, I'm not against Smith necessarily. I don't think Scalia was entirely wrong. I don't think that religious liberty, that all of the difficulties of having a pluralist republic with religious liberty are solved just by reference to the First Amendment itself. It requires some commitment from the legislatures. After Smith, legislatures did immediately intervene to remedy what they saw as a perverse result. And so I suppose as a consequentialist, if the court vindicates the right of Catholics and evangelicals and Jews and Muslims to practice their faith via getting rid of Smith, I guess I would welcome that, just as a pure matter of consequentialism. I don't think it's necessarily right. And, I don't think we're sailed out of the choppy waters yet. I think that's why we have a 77-page Alito concurrence here, a concurrence that's not altogether that happy.
Charlie Kokex, question to you. Today's decisions make you more favorable to the current court, less favorable, the same?
About the same, in that this is what I expected, but I was pleasantly surprised, narrow as it was, to see even Sotomayor joining with Fulton.
MBD.
The same. I mean, it's terrifying, actually, because I think many more sensible decisions on these very real conflicts could be made in legislatures where it's done by gross horse trading and compromise, rather than trying to decide everything by reference to principle with 9 philosopher kings. I mean, I'm tired of holding my breath like this and trying to divine what really look like, sometimes ad hoc reasonings by these courts.
Yeah, I would say the same. I'm sure I'll be disappointed about something soon, and worried about still the court being willing to kind of buck the cultural tide. But there's no doubt we've made great progress on the court, and people who say the conservative movement has achieved nothing, which is wrong on a bunch of really important grounds, but the court is a constant rebuke to that. And folks who also say that the Constitution, et cetera, can't save us. This just goes to the First Amendment being a bulwark, one that might not hold over time, but a bulwark against what the left is trying to do in the country. With that, let's talk a little bit more about that. Our next sponsor is criticalrace.org. Critical race theory is sweeping American higher education. At Wake Forest University, the Department of Mathematics and Statistics has implemented, quote, anti-racist math coursework. In spring 2021, the University of New Hampshire began offering a class on racism in science. And the University of Pittsburgh's medical school has even added a vow against system racism to the 2,500-year-old Hippocratic Oath. It's happening at universities throughout America and across curricula, from history to architecture, from medicine to economics. Critical race theory, the idea that America is an inherently racist country, that each American must be reprogrammed to dispel his or her intrinsic racism, is opposed by an overwhelming majority of Americans. Yet leaders in higher education, from prestigious Ivy League campuses to state schools in the Deep South, continue to impose this radical ideology on students and faculty alike. Funded by a Cornell law professor, criticalrace.org is a definitive resource for students, parents, alumni, university donors, and all Americans concerned about the continued creep of critical race theory in higher education. The investigative journalists at Legal Insurrection Foundation provide you with the latest updates on how individual schools are implementing critical race training, how local, state, and federal governments are getting involved, and how some parents and states are fighting back. To stop this toxic and un-American ideology, we must be diligent. Criticalrace.org is the resource you need to stay informed about this assault on higher education in America. Don't delay. Visit criticalrace.org today. That's criticalrace.org. Please check it out. So MBD, we had the long-awaited, or at least medium-term awaited, Biden-Putin summit yesterday. Not much came of this. I guess it was supposed to be a 5-hour meeting. It was a 3-hour meeting. There were some, really paper-thin agreements to, pursue more arms control and the like. Not a joint press conference, thankfully. Separate press conferences. Putin lied and evaded, made ridiculous statements throughout his. Biden, I thought it was appropriately tough on Putin, but had some rocky moments at his own press conference, especially when he allowed himself to get baited by Caitlin Collins. He was about to safely exit the area, get out of his press conference, all his communication staffs and everyone ready to breathe a sigh of relief. And then he comes back pointing a finger at Caitlin Collins, telling her she doesn't know what she's doing and wasn't listening to what he was really saying. What do you make of it?
Well, there have been two, it's interesting. There are a couple of contrary critiques being offered of Biden. One is, elected Republicans are saying that in general, Biden was weak throughout this foreign trip and with Putin. And one of the signs of that weakness was that for some reason, reporters that do get questions into Biden tend to ask about domestic politics, and Biden takes the occasion to punch Republicans on a stage where that's not appropriate at all. Then there's also been the criticism maybe from conservative or right-wing, kind of populist media, new media, radio, saying that Biden's weak because he just refuses to answer questions, whereas Putin struts around, not only confidently taking whatever queries are thrown his way, but also like openly trolling the United States, like when he gave that little presser where he talked about the prosecution of the January 6th rioters. I think everyone's right. I think Biden was weak. I think Biden looks weak. I think he could take more questions without reacting insanely. I do think it's totally inappropriate to criticize your domestic opposition when you're the leader of a democratic country in an international conference setting. I mean, that feels very like it just feels like a third world junta when you do that. You sound self-obsessed and monomaniacal. Politics really should stop as much as possible at the border. So yeah, I didn't think it was very good. It's just very notable though that Joe Biden is the first president since Ronald Reagan who has come into office not immediately seeking a better relationship with Russia. I mean, he's cooled his rhetoric somewhat when people said, "Oh, is Putin still a killer?" And he kind of said, "Oh, he's a worthy adversary," which was a weird coinage. But from the reset to some of the initial post 9/11 overtures made by George W. Bush to, obviously much more dramatic gestures by Reagan and even President Bush and Clinton, this is still a very frosty relationship, and it's kind of still at a post-Cold War nadir, right? Where each side has thrown out tons of diplomatic staff. There's much less chatter between Russia and the United States. The only place we seem to talk is Syria, where we try to avoid bombing each other. It's not a great geopolitical relationship, and I don't think Biden is going to change it in any significant way.
Charlie, as you know, our listeners just wait at the edge of their seats, Charlie, for your takes on foreign policy. So
I don't think it's an overstatement to say that my view of this trip will become the canonical one. So I better choose my words carefully. It seems to me that nothing was particularly gained and nothing was particularly lost. Of course, we're told that this was a great triumph and that, how did Max Boot and Jennifer Rubin put it? Vladimir Putin slunk off into the corner. Magnificent Joe Biden dropped him from the top rope. But I don't quite know what was achieved. That's not a criticism of Biden. It's not necessarily the case that something has to be or could be achieved. But what exactly justified this outpouring of praise?
Certainly, by the Trump standards, it was dropping Putin from the top rope.
Well, I suppose so, unless you care about Nord Stream 2, in which case all of that is fluff, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I don't think that Biden did anything particularly wrong, including shout at Caitlin Collins, which Trump did too, and got a completely different reaction having done, which again is sort of the point. This was a fine trip. American leaders should do this. They should go talk to people in leadership positions in different countries. I was pleased, I know you wrote about this in Politico, Rich, to see Biden putting pressure on China. That is something in our politics that Trump has changed, albeit Mitt Romney also started that process. I don't quite understand the hyperbole. I'm not embarrassed that Joe Biden represented the United States on the world stage, except for his repeated attempts to bring the topic back to domestic politics, which he did twice, not just at that press conference, but on the steps of Air Force One. He started talking about January 6th, which, yes, was a disgrace, but really is not the right place to be talking about it. And I wasn't thrilled he was there either. So this was a first trip. It was okay. I don't know quite what America gained. There was a weird moment, and I'm still trying to get to the bottom of this, where Biden said that he had told Vladimir Putin that there were 16 areas of crucial infrastructure that were off limits. And I thought, well, aren't they all off limits? But I'm told that this is apparently how diplomats talk behind closed doors. They say, yes, we all spy on each other. We all engage in espionage to some extent, but there are certain areas we will regard as so far off limits that they might create a cause for war. It's not usual, as far as I understand, for US presidents to say this out loud in front of the press, but maybe that's what he was doing. That struck me as odd. But I would just ask, what did we gain? I mean, we didn't lose anything, we didn't gain anything. But really, the biggest story of America-Russia relations is Nord Stream 2, and that actually is bad.
MBD, X question to you. The next international crisis is more likely to be caused by Russia or by China?
Here's the thing. I guess I just don't rate. So, like, in conventional understanding, it will be Russia, because they'll do something provocative and ambiguous on their western edge, and people will.
I guess I should have added will be caused by Russia, China, or NATO.
Oh, well, I mean, certainly NATO. I'm sure there's some band of Islamist terrorists, Sunni Islamist terrorists, who are going after some Shia fool that we can arm stupidly and create another refugee crisis. But besides that, yeah, I think Russia will do something that will cause international outrage, particularly because we've made Ukraine's status so ambiguous, so like we've basically created in Ukraine an easy way for Putin to humiliate the European Union and NATO and the United States. So I am worried about that. But I do think my own personal view, though, is that China's moves to revise things in East Asia is far more consequential than that.
Charlie Cook, Russia or China?
China, without question.
So I'm actually where MBD is. I think the next crisis is more likely to be caused by Russia, ransomware, and something on its western edge, as MBD puts it. But obviously, the more consequential power, the one that is more likely to cause World War III, the one that's more likely to precipitate a nuclear exchange, is China, just without a doubt.
Rich, I'm a little confused because I said China. So that's obviously the answer.
No, Russia will cause the next one, but China is the bigger threat.
No, I know, but I'm just saying, given that I am now the source of all canonical information on foreign policy.
Yes, I forgot about the canonical thing.
Yeah.
So with that, let me do a quick NR Plus plug, which I haven't done in a while. NR Plus digital subscription service at nationalreview.com. Your way around our highly annoying metered paywall. Your way to dispense with almost all of our highly annoying ads, and your way to comment on articles and blog posts if that's what you want, but if that's what floats your boat. But you sign up for NR Plus, doesn't cost you much. We have great first time deals running at pretty much any given moment. Then you need to log in to the website. If you're an NR Plus member, we love you. We're glad you signed up, but you need to make sure you log into the website, and then almost all the ads disappear. It's a transformative reading experience. And again, you don't have to deal with the metered paywall. It's also your way to support our journalism, which we consider important and valuable, but we need some people paying to read it. And we are very grateful to our print subscribers and our NR Plus subscribers and people who buy the bundle, which means you both digital and print. And if you're not already one of them, I encourage you to go look at your options and pick one that seems most appropriate for you and try it out. So Charlie, we got this roiling grassroots backlash going on against critical race theory in school districts and states around the country. I wrote a big piece about the South Lake, Texas example, which is sort of textbook, like just incredible, just like unbelievable, quote unquote, anti-racist document that the school board was going to approve and impose on the schools. Parents get wind of it. They instantly organize and push back against the school board every possible way, FOIA, lawsuits, and then ultimately go and elect 2 of their own members to the school board. We're seeing similar things happening around the country. And now, of course, the backlash to the backlash is starting, where you have the mainstream and the left-wing press saying, oh, this is AstroTurf. Oh, this is a moral panic. There's no such thing as critical race theory in most of these school districts. What do you make of it?
It's not AstroTurf, and those who are advancing that argument will soon find out, much to their chagrin, that it is not AstroTurf. I can't, of course, prove that at this point, but I'll be happy to revisit that prediction. There's so much lying here. We talked last time about the Mott and Bailey game that advocates of critical race theory play. There's also just flat out lying. The argument yesterday was that anyone who is opposed to critical race theory is opposed to teaching about racism, as opposed to teaching about slavery or Jim Crow or the civil rights movement. This is absolute nonsense. The question is, how are those things taught? And I thought it was instructive. One of the writers of this terrible NBC article on the question of the backlash to critical race theory posted this letter from a school district in Maine. This aha tone. And he said, people say that this letter accuses parents of being white supremacists, but it doesn't. Well, I read this letter, and it's, I suppose, arguable that it doesn't say that. But if I received this letter, I wouldn't just take my kids out of that school. I'd burn it down. Because it might not say that the parents are white supremacists, but it does say that America is white supremacist, that Maine is white supremacist, that the school district is white supremacist. And all of the telling lines in it are about bringing down systems, changing systems, smashing systems. And that's not what a school is for. And that is what critical race theory is for. There is an enormous difference between saying, here are the values of the United States, and here is how we have fallen short. There is an enormous difference between saying, let's not have some myopic, adulatory view of the United States and its history. Let's tell all of the stories. And saying the key lens and framework is race and the power structures that it has engendered. There's a good piece today by John McWhorter, Columbia University. He's written for National Review before, saying, of course it's not racist to oppose critical race theory, laying out what critical race theory is, what it means in this context, explaining that actually, yes, this is being taught and introduced increasingly in schools, and arguing that really it's not so much the opponents of critical race theory who are being vague in their language, it's the advocates of critical race theory who use terms like white supremacy as a catch-all, as a totally unfalsifiable concept that has apparently infected all elements. So this is real. It's not a moral panic. It's not astroturfed. Parents who are reacting to it, either directly or preemptively, are doing so out of a genuine concern. And this is not going to go away. However many times Jane Mayer tweets her conspiracies, it's not going to go away, because white parents, black parents, Hispanic parents, Asian parents, they do not, by and large, oppose the teaching of America's sins or important American history. It's not black history, it's American history, slavery. They do oppose race essentialism. And that is what critical race theory in its most distilled form will look like when taught in schools.
Yeah, MBD, the backlash to the backlash, if you will, reminds me very much of what we saw early on in the Tea Party. I'm sure Jane Mayer was saying exactly the same thing. If she wasn't, many others were. This is AstroTurf, and these people are crazy. They're making stuff up, and this is just this dynamic's running in a familiar rut of conservative grassroots movements and how the left reacts to them. I haven't gone back and looked at the debate over Phyllis Schlafly and her movement against the Equal Rights Amendment, but I'm sure that was exactly the same as well. This is just how these things go.
Yeah, by the way, just a note, Phyllis Schlafly predicted that we would lose single gender bathrooms and was laughed at in the 60s. And we're still getting the returns on her prophetic work.
Right. That
60 years later. This is very much a real thing. It's funny, they missed the Tea Party because they didn't take seriously Republican opposition, which wasn't just popular, but was also among House members to bailouts under Bush, right? I mean, that was a real vote that the establishment thought was devastating. And now they're not taking seriously the fact that, soccer moms are showing up even in affluent school districts to denounce critical race theory and to call their local school boards communists, right? That happened near me locally. And it's very real. People experience, what they are putting under the label critical race theory is like a whole series of different ideas that are au courant since about 2014. But which are the culmination of the new progressive argument that American ideals and institutions, going all the way back to the founding on our Constitution, are all camouflage for white racial domination and a white racial conspiracy against this rising a kind of proletariat of skin color. And people are experiencing this not only in the material that the schools are sending out, they're experiencing it in like the budgets of their local school district. My own local school district kind of put out a statement trying to head off this reaction, saying, we're not teaching critical race theory. We don't give our teachers instruction in critical race theory, but we're still committed to our statement of anti-racism that we put out earlier in the year, which they put out, and it was pure Ibram X. Kendi drivel about the need for anti-racist pedagogy. And, it came along with all these vows to closely monitor every teacher's grading and their exercise of discipline in the classroom for signs of racial bias, which itself is a kind of oddity. And people don't only experience it in the schools, they also experience it in their workplaces now, as it's filtering in through HR. They also kind of experience it as like the sum total inheritance of Title VII legislation, which, if there's someone who is underperforming in the company, but they are a racial minority, there has to be all sorts of documentation taken in order to protect oneself from a civil rights lawsuit for unjust dismissal. And people experience that as a real unfairness. And, it's also just not surprising, right? Like, two theorists who support critical race theory say that this method of interrogation, quote, questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law.
Is that all?
End quote. So basically, it is a full-scale attack on American civil society and civil compact. Of course, this is going to be explosive in a public school setting, right? Because the public school is this institution in which all local residents pay for it to exist. And part of its mission, going back to Dewey, right, was to create Americans, right? Like, I might object to that for Catholic reactionary reasons, but that was the compact that's been made. It's been one that's been overwhelmingly accepted. And now this theory comes in and says, like, we're actually going to teach people to dwell incessantly on their racial identities and make them dwell incessantly on racial antagonisms, which is, people see that as a direct attack on the peace of their communities, and the self-worth of their children, right? I mean, it's like, you see even letters from students coming out saying that, white students were being taught to say "we" in reference to slaveholding.
Yeah.
And it's like, that is actually nuts. And it's a kind of denial of history itself.
So, next question to you, Charlie Cook. In your estimation, the current backlash against critical race theory all around the country will be more or less consequential than the Tea Party ended up being?
Ooh, I don't know. I suspect less, purely because the Obama election in 2008 had put the Democrats in such a remarkable position that the fervor was perhaps greater than it will be with a 50-50 Senate and a close House. But I do think that this is a real backlash and it will have real effects, as the Tea Party did.
MBD.
I think this is bigger. I think this is, I think it activates a much more primal defense mechanism of the American system, precisely because it targets people's self-worth and self-understanding. And so I think it will be met with a furious response. And I think you can already detect some people on the left, some of the backlash to the backlash is saying, we don't really teach this. We don't. It's a kind of backhanded way of backing away from critical race theory, because I think they know this is really ground that isn't propitious for them to fight on, and it could take down more than they bargained for.
Yeah, I got to pat myself on the back. This is a really interesting and tough exit question. A simple one, but interesting and tough, because they're really different dimensions. I mean, the Tea Party produced huge rallies, just enormous rallies, had a hand in a big congressional sweep that put a stop to at least a lot of the Obama agenda, elevated senators who became big stars and ran for president and then got stomped by Trump, like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. But then, it was sort of a fizzle in the end. It ended up being a little bit more of an attitude and then being taken over by Trump, which few people would have expected at the beginning. I don't see, people getting elected to Congress or becoming new senators and stars in the Senate on this latest movement, but it could be more consequential. Just I endorse what Michael is getting at. This is a real threat to our national identity, and there are real concrete victories that are going to be won here. And not all parts of the country are going to be saved from this, but a lot will. And if occasionally in some places people are being overly sensitive and overly capacious in their definition of critical race theory, but still elect people who are going to be eternally vigilant against this stuff, so be it. All to the good. So I guess I would tip to say it's going to be more consequential. With that, let's hit a few other things before we go. MBD, what else have you been up to?
So I just want to say something that is a little difficult to say. I'm sure Charlie will appreciate it. But very recently in my town, a little British goods shop opened up.
You're welcome.
And the street is filled with Union Jacks. And just for anyone who can pick up what I'm putting down, I just can't tell you how happy and relieved I am to see Union Jacks in June rather than another flag, which is ever present.
Charlie.
I've been listening to a podcast. It is produced and hosted by a friend of mine from university called Gareth Russell, who's an excellent author. He's written on a wide variety of topics, including the Titanic, Last Emperors of Europe, Wives of Henry VIII, and his podcast is called Single Malt History, which should give you some indication of how we became friends and what we were doing. But it's engaging, and it's just very nice also for me to sit and hear his voice, given we live on different sides of the Atlantic. So I'd recommend that to anyone who likes history. He takes a topic. One of the ones I liked the most was the sinking of the Lusitania, and he just talks about it for an hour. He also has guests on, professional historians and others. A Single Malt History. You can find it pretty much everywhere podcasts are sold, although this isn't sold. It's free.
So I love Indian food, but no one else in my family does. So pretty much the only time I get to eat Indian food is on my birthday, when we get to go to an Indian restaurant or get a big Indian takeout. But last weekend I made tandoori chicken, and no, I don't have a clay oven, but it's relatively simple to make tandoori chicken on a grill. You get some drumsticks, you mix kind of some characteristic Indian spices in some oil, heat it up on the stove. Then you chop up some garlic, you chop up a little ginger, you get some lemon, and you get a bowl. You mix it all in there. I'm forgetting now a major ingredient. What major ingredient am I forgetting? Let me look up the recipe as I speak. But anyway, you marinate it overnight, and then you put it on the grill and you grill it hot, and so you get that nice char, and you have, not a restaurant worthy tandoori chicken, but a pretty good tandoori chicken, which I highly recommend. What
Rich?
Yogurt. You need yogurt's the base of the marinade. So do the spices, you mix it, yogurt, lemon juice, some garlic, and some ginger.
Rich, I have to tell you this. When my dad was in the Air Force in the 1970s, his best friend was Indian. And he used to cook curries for my dad. In fact, he taught my dad how to cook curry. And one day they're cooking together, and my dad says to his friend Desh, what's this spice? And joking, Desh says hashish. And my dad, being naive, didn't know what hashish was. So he writes it down. About 2 weeks later, he decides he's going to cook a curry on his own. So he drives into Cambridge, finds a store run by Indian immigrants, walks straight up to the counter and says to the guy loudly, "Hi there, I'm looking to buy some hashish." This guy sort of starts looking funny and looks around and says, "Get out of my store, get out of my store." My dad's saying, "What? I just want to buy some hashish. I like to put it in my curry, like my friend Dish." And he's ejected from this store. So he's completely confused by this. And it's the 70s, so there aren't many other places to buy Indian spices. So he goes back to the base and tells Dish this. And of course, he just falls about laughing. And every single time I've seen Dish since, he reminds my dad of this. So at least you didn't get it wrong in that way.
All right. Well, it's that time of the podcast for our editor's picks. MBD. What's your pick?
Once again, I'm picking a Charles Cook piece. His latest, "Have Journalists Ever Met the People They Write About?" You can tell from the title what mode Charlie is in when he's writing this way about other journalists, and you just can't miss it. He's been a Gatling gun, a 16-pounder gun, firing ever since he joined us down in the pit of writers once more.
Charlie, what's your pick?
My pick's Dan McLaughlin's much awaited and thoroughly deserved hit on all of those legal writers and elected Democrats who said over and over again that Amy Coney Barrett was nominated to the Supreme Court explicitly to get rid of Obamacare. As the kids say, Dan has the receipts. I suspect he's had this one in his back pocket for a long time waiting for the result, and he lays it all out.
Stole my thunder.
You were going to do that too?
That was my pick. That was my pick. Yeah, just goes to show listeners we do not coordinate our editors' picks on this podcast. So that's it for us. You've been listening to a National Review podcast, and your rebroadcast, retransmission, or account of this game without the express written permission of National Review Magazine is strictly prohibited. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte. You make the sound better than we deserve. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, MBD. Thanks to criticalrace.org. And thanks especially to all of you for listening. We are the editors. See you next time.